Hi everyone. The third Sunday of Advent week deals with the arrival of God, and the question begs, why did God take so long to send Jesus? Dr. Williams spoke of the myth of instancy, the idea that we live in a society that wants everything to happen yesterday, but that in reality things don't work like that. They work much slower, especially the things that are important. Now, these two topics are actually interwoven quite nicely in the Bible because our desire to have things instantly done is very often in contradiction with the way that God does things. God doesn't do things instantly most of the time, or definitely not with regards to His gospel, and definitely not with regards to Jesus and how He interacted with the world. But we live in this instant society where more value is placed on instant gratification than on waiting for things. People want this McDonald's type lifestyle where you basically order from a menu, you click, you check out, you pay, and you get your McDonald's burger. But life doesn't work like that. I mean, if you think about it, if you wanted to train for the Comrades Marathon, right? Would it be reasonable for you to wake up one morning and say, you know what, the Comrades is the end of this week. I'm going to go jog a little bit and then actually try and run the Comrades? Well, you're going to fail horribly. Absolutely going to fail horribly. What about weight loss? Weight loss is the same thing. People that try fad diets or instant diets, they are often disillusioned because the thing just doesn't work. You've got to work at a lifestyle and then you reap the rewards over time. But there's no such thing as an instant diet that stays with you forever. In other words, you don't have an instant diet and then you reap the benefits of that forever. What about building relationships? I've heard of people where they are separated with vast distances and then they don't communicate with one another, and then they think that they're in a relationship. But if you don't speak to the person, or you don't WhatsApp them, or you don't email them, or you don't have any contact with them, you have no physical contact with them, eventually you will drift apart. That's just the way the world works. So relationships, they require you to be there. That's a problem. I mean, if you work all the time and if you've got kids and you don't spend time with them, don't be surprised by the time they're 16 if they hate your guts. It's really the way the world works. What about building character? Character is one of those things that is developed over time. There's a commitment that you've got to make towards building character. It's not something that happens instantly. Or what about drawing close to God? You've got to put the time in. You've got to put the time in with Bible study, with prayer, with meditation, with fasting, because you can have a great high at an SCP or some youth camp, and you can have this great spiritual experience, but that's not going to keep you going for the rest of your life, that one experience. You've got to put the work in. See, sometimes the best way to learn is the long and the hard way. Sometimes that is the best way to achieve lasting results. And I can attest to that. I was about 6 years old and I had developed a nasty little habit. Well, I have to call it a habit is an understatement. I had discovered the arcade games on the cafe on the corner there by us. And this was the 80s, right? So we didn't have Xbox or PlayStation or really computers that was available, in your house that you can just play a game. There were no cell phones. You couldn't just play a game in your cell phone. So for you to play a game, you had to go to an arcade, or you needed to go to a cafe. And at the cafe, there would be like arcade games. My problem was we didn't have a lot of money, but I discovered that I could steal from my family. So I used to break into my sister's. So they had like a flat that was joining to ours. So I would break into a flat and I would steal her Coke bottles. Remember the Coke bottles that you return for money? So I used to climb in there, go get the Coke bottles, and then I would go to the shop, hand them in, and I would have my 20 cents or 40 cents or whatever, and I could play some games. But my mother found this out. Well, specifically because my sister went to her and said to her, the weirdest thing is happening. Every week we buy Coke, and we've got these 1.5 liter glass bottles and they just disappear. We just don't know where they're going. My mother's like, this is fishy. So she catches me. Anyway, she sits me down. She says to me, look, man, you're going to get a hiding. And in a moment of inspiration, I say to her, I tell you what, Mom, I'm truly sorry. I'm going to ask Jesus for forgiveness. I'm going to pray to God. I'm going to ask Him to forgive my sins, and I'm going to be a new person, all right? I'm not going to do this again. You don't have to worry. I am reformed. And she said, really? She says, yeah, no, not a problem. In fact, I'll sweeten the pot. What we do is the next time, if, and I'm pretty sure that this is not going to happen, I won't steal again, but if it should happen, then you can double the hiding you were supposed to give me. So you were going to give me 2 lashes, but now what you can do is next time you can give me 4. What do you think about that? And she's like, okay, that's an interesting concept. But it didn't look like she was quite sold on it. So I pushed it a little bit hard and I said, I tell you what, why don't we just even raise the ante even more? If it happens again after that, you can just double it every time. You can just double it every time. So she says, so you're saying to me, the next time you're going to get 4 lashes and the time after that, 8 lashes and like that? Yeah, it's not a problem because I've learned my lesson, because I'm a child of God. Anyway, so a week later, she catches me stealing again. And she sits me down and she says, okay, look, son, you're not going to get your hiding. And I couldn't really worm out of it, so I get my 4 lashes. Time goes by, she catches me again. Now all of a sudden I've got 8 lashes, right? Time goes by and she catches me again because I still haven't learned my lesson. So now we're up to 16. This is getting like, it's like child abuse, right? But I wanted this. This was the deal. And my mother was like, you made a deal with me, so now we've got to stick to the deal. So time goes by and I'm a little bit better, but eventually I do it again and she catches me, and now we're up to 32 lashes that I'm supposed to get. 32 lashes. So she locks me in the room. She had to lock me in the room because I was running around. And she had this leather strap that she used to chase me with, but she was adamant. She was going to give me my hiding. I got to about 20 and then she felt sorry for me because she was like, she's probably going to beat me to death. Well, not quite, but you get the idea. Now, why did it take me so long to change my behavior? Like, this is the thing about this idea, this myth of instancy. We think that things can happen quickly. It took several times. It took weeks. I don't remember how long it took, but it took a while for me to get the message that this behavior is really bad for me, and that playing these games are going to be problematic for me. And eventually I did, end up stopping stealing, but it was horrible. I mean, she almost had to kind of beat me to a pulp before I learned my lesson. How often does that happen with us in life? That we end up doing things again and again and again. It's like we just don't learn. So clearly the idea that we can do things instantly seems to be a myth. Now, if we set the scene for Jesus' arrival, there's a couple of things we need to look at. First, there were 400 years of silence between the last prophet that came and John the Baptist, who's now kind of coming onto the scene. So during this 400 years of silence, God did not speak. He didn't send a prophet to warn the Jews, or to warn the Israelites. And it began with a warning that closed the Old Testament that said, behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers, so that I will come and smite the land with a curse. That was Malachi 4 verses 5 to 6. And ended with the coming of John the Baptist, the Messiah, who would be the forerunner. So that was like the 400 years of silence. And we pick up the story in Luke chapter 3, verses 17 to 18. So here John has now kind of come out, he's in the wilderness, he starts preaching, and he's drawing massive crowds, like everybody. Pharisees are there, soldiers are there, common folk are there, because now God has sent this messenger. And John looked the part. I mean, he was like full-on prophet, the way that he came across. So in verse 7 he says, John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized to him, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourself, we have Abram as our father. For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abram. The axe is already at the root of the tree, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. What should we do then? The crowd asked. And John answered, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with those that have none, and anyone that has food should do the same. Even tax collectors came to be baptized. Teacher, they asked, what should we do? He said to them, don't collect any more than you are required to. Then some soldiers asked him, and what should we do? And he replied, don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay. The people were waiting expectantly and were all wondering in their hearts if John might possibly be the Messiah, right? So they think that he is the Messiah. They've been waiting for the Messiah for a long time. And they're thinking maybe this John guy, he looks like he's Messiah material. He's got the right stuff. Verse 16, John answered them all, I baptize you with water, but the one who is more powerful than I will come, the straps of whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork in his hand, his winnowing fork is in his hand to clear the threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his barn. But he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. And with many other words, John exhorted the people and proclaimed the good news to them. Right, so this is the scene that is set before Jesus kind of arrives. And we know what then happened. Jesus goes to John, he's baptized, he starts his ministry. And then for the next 3 years or so, he's this preacher that goes around the countryside preaching, got this incredible wisdom that he shares with the world, and then he's crucified. So John sets the scene for the arrival of Jesus. And Israel had, in the time preceding the 400 years, there had been 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, 4 major rise and falls of the Israelite empire. See, the Israelites would go and they would be faithful and will build up their society, and then they would abandon God when they become affluent, when they become, when they start looking at worshipping other gods, especially some of the kings of Israel did horrible things. And after the last cycle, God had sent a prophet again, and this time not to warn the people, but to usher in the Messiah. That would now be John. But why did it take so long? Why did it take hundreds of years? In fact, we're going to see now that it took even longer than hundreds of years in order for Jesus to come onto the scene. You see, we look at the Bible as one book, but that's not the case. In fact, it comprises 66 books written by about 40 authors over a period of 1,500 years, and that's a long time. If we then make it even longer by counting in the time between Adam and Jesus, and looking at the genealogy and kind of tracing it, assuming that there are no gaps, we'll get to about 4,000 years. 4,000 years. That's the total span of it. 4,000 years. That's a long time to wait for the Messiah. That's a long time to wait for the Messiah. I mean, how many lifetimes is that? So it's not surprising that people that have a very short relatively short lifespan and a very short view of eternity, the way that we look at life, because we're mortal, would get to a point it's like, he's not coming. Jesus isn't coming, the Messiah isn't coming, I might as well do whatever I want, because ultimately, it doesn't matter. People sometimes do that. That's the way that they look at life. But why did it take so long? I mean, that's the question, right? Why did Jesus take so long in order for him to come onto the scene? Why wasn't it right after Adam and Eve, maybe 100 years or 200 years, something decent, maybe 1,000 years? Why was it so long before Jesus came onto the scene? Now, I think that the clues for this lies in the setup, the stuff that God needed to put in place before Jesus would arrive. And there are several things that point to that. But one of the things that point to that I find very interesting is the Old Testament prophecies. There's roughly about 300 prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament. And there was a guy by the name of Peter Stoner, who was the chairman of the Department of Mathematics and Astronomy at Pasadena College. And he was very passionate about biblical prophecies. So he, with about 600 students from the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, they went and they looked at 8 specific prophecies about Jesus. And they came up with an extremely conservative probability for each one of these 8 being fulfilled by an individual, and then considered the likelihood of Jesus fulfilling all of those 8 prophecies during his lifetime. What they found was truly interesting. It was like mind-blowing. So what they did was they said, okay, the prospect of one person in history fulfilling just 8 of the 300 prophecies, the math of that came to about 1 in 10 to the power of 17. So 10 with 17 zeros behind it. So if you're going to try and visualize that, let's start with something small and we work our way up. So if you take a hat, and in the hat you cut 10 pieces of paper, and you put it in the hat and you mix it up and you randomly mark a piece of paper, the chances that somebody randomly, or if they're blindfolded, will pick that piece of paper out is 1 in 10, right? So that's a 1 in 10 chance. Now in this instance, we're talking about 10 to the power of 17. So if you wanted to create a visual kind of analogy, what Stoner did is he said, okay, if you take silver dollars, because he's an American, if you take silver dollars and you were to lay them end to end over the state of Texas, and Texas is massive, it's a huge state in the USA. If you were to place these silver dollars end to end and you would cover the entire state of Texas, you would find that 10 to the power of 17 silver dollars would cover Texas about 2 feet deep. That's very deep. Now, if you randomly marked one of these silver dollars, randomly marked it and placed it randomly somewhere in the state of Texas, and then blindfolded somebody and said to them that they can drive anywhere they want, any direction in the state of Texas, and they can stop at any time that they want, and wherever they stop, whatever coin they pick up must have the mark on it. That is 1 to 10, a 1 in 10 to the power of 157. That's how scary the odds are. I mean, it's infinitesimally small. So what would be the chance of getting that right? I mean, just the same chance that the prophets would have of writing these 8 prophecies and having them all come true in any one man from their day to the present time. It's absolutely incredible. Now, the odds of Jesus' profile matching all 300 prophecies. Remember, we said 10 to the power, 1 in 10 to the power of 17. The odds of Jesus' profile matching the top, 300 of these prophecies works out to 1 to, wait for it, 10 to the power of 157. 157 zeros. So 10 with 157 zeros behind it. That is absolutely insane. So the point is that Jesus was God was very specific about who Jesus needed to be, when he needed to be, and all the things that, I mean, if that is not evidence of divinity, then I don't know what is. Honestly, if that's not evidence of divinity, to be able to kind of plan all these things over thousands of years to match one specific individual in time, that is only the divine. So, and if you think about it, the reason why it took so long is that Jesus needed to be born under very specific circumstances to match prophecies. I mean, if we look at just a couple of them, and this is just a couple because, like I said, there's over 300. But for one, Jesus needed to die by crucifixion. So he's like, okay, fine, he needed to die by crucifixion. But the interesting thing here is Isaiah chapter 7 verses 14 predicts that Jesus will die by crucifixion 800 years before crucifixion was invented. So the mechanism for killing Jesus hadn't been invented for 800 years, and God had already said this is the way it's going to happen. What about Bethlehem? Bethlehem is now famous, but back then, Bethlehem was like nobody knew about it. Nobody cared about Bethlehem. In Micah 5 verses 2, 700 years before the event took place, he predicted that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Now, the modern comparison would probably, in South African context, would probably be something like Piet Zonnewater. Have you ever heard of Piet Zonnewater? Well, Piet Zonnewater is a abandoned settlement in the Northern Cape. I don't know where it is. I honestly don't care. That's how people viewed Bethlehem. It's like Bethlehem? Who cares about Bethlehem? The other thing that was interesting is that there was a time limit as well. You know, God couldn't just plan this thing forever and ever, because there was a prophecy that said, you know, the Messiah had to come before the temple was destroyed. That was in Malachi 3 verses 1. More than that, we find things like Jesus had to be convicted of a crime, right? He had to suffer. He had to be the suffering servant. He had to die for something, but he could not be guilty of it. It's not like he could kill somebody and then, you know, be executed for murder, because then he wouldn't be the perfect sacrifice. So he had to be sinless. He had to go on trumped up charges and then be convicted of something that he wasn't guilty of. So the punishment of the crime also had to be the death penalty. It's not like just let's do a fine or a prison sentence. It needed to be the death penalty. It needed to be serious. So if you think about it, what was quite interesting is that Jesus was initially accused of blasphemy by the religious kind of establishment, right? Because the Pharisees and the Sadducees said, "Oh, you claiming to be God, and that's blasphemy." And under the Old Covenant, they could stone him to death. I mean, they could execute him for blasphemy. It was a capital crime. But the problem that they sat with is that when Rome took over Judea, they said, no. This idea that you can execute people, you can't just do that. Capital crimes and the punishment associated with it can only be dispensed by Rome. So now they had the problem. The problem was how do they legitimately execute Jesus for blasphemy? Well, to be honest, the Romans didn't care. And so what they had to do is trump up charges of sedition, that he was going to raise an army, that he was going to compete with Rome, that he was going to basically, try and take on Rome. And that's then what happens, is they go to Pontius Pilate and they say, he calls himself the King of the Jews. And when Pontius Pilate asks him this, and Jesus is like, "Oh, that's what you say, man. If you say so, it must be true." And Pontius Pilate's like, "This guy isn't guilty of this." And that's why he washed his hands, remember, in water. So Pontius Pilate then forces them and says, "Well, you need to put the sign up and says, 'Here's the King of the Jews,' because that's the only way that he could legitimize the execution." So it's fascinating how throughout history, all these things had to be set up to match this very specific profile, profile. And how does this all play out while still keeping humanity's free will intact? That kind of blows my mind. The other thing that I find fascinating about Jesus was that the timing was extremely auspicious. I mean, God planned it this way, I suppose, is the best way to say it. But think about it. It was a Passover, so Jews from all over the world needed to be in Jerusalem, right? They had to make their pilgrimage to get there. But it was also a Sabbath, so the place was jam-packed. It was like jam-packed. And there was the maximum amount of eyeballs that saw Jesus crucified. It's like if you wanted the maximum amount of witnesses to an event, that was it. Right? And all these witnesses saw him during, and of course, after the crucifixion, there was over 500 people that witnessed the resurrected Jesus. This is very important because there are people, atheists out there, some people have said, we don't know if Jesus really existed, we're not sure if he did. The problem is that there are non-biblical sources, like it's not even the Bible, this is other people that refer to certain aspects of Jesus, his life, his death, his crucifixion, that proves that he was an historical figure. So we even have evidence for Jesus that's outside of the Bible. We don't even need to look at the Bible to see that Jesus existed. And what about the 12 people that would become the apostles? These people were nobodies on paper. I mean, fishermen. Fishermen, really? And a tax collector. Super dodgy guy. But what ends up happening is that these people become these champions for Jesus and for Christianity, and they end up dying for what they believe. The vast majority of them died horrible deaths, defending not what they believed, but what they saw. Like, this is different to when people say, there is some sort of fanatic, this religious fanatic. That person was brought up a fanatic. He was, kind of brainwashed. Like, these people were Jews, first and foremost. They weren't Christians. And they grew up believing that there's this monotheistic God and that man was not God. And here they meet Jesus and he says, like, I am God. And they believed him and he died and they saw him resurrected. That was a complete mind shift for them. So they didn't die for what they thought to be true. They died for what they saw with their own eyes. It's a very, very different story. And in there, we have Jesus' own brother. I mean, what does it take for your brother or for your sister to believe that you are God? I mean, they know you for who you are. And you have got James, Jesus' half-brother. Anyway, the other thing that I found fascinating is that after the crucifixion, the world was in the best possible space for the gospel to be spread. Like, we don't think about these things, like the logistics behind it. But one of the advantages of the Roman Empire was that it was a massive empire and that it had built massive infrastructure. There were roads, for example, a common language, Greek. There was a common written language, the ability to communicate via letters. If you look at, like, the Apostle Paul, the letters that he wrote to the churches in Asia Minor, we still have those copies. We've got copies of copies, but we've got them today. And that makes up our New Testament. That would not have been possible a couple of 100 years before because the infrastructure wasn't there. It wasn't there. So the timing behind this is incredibly auspicious. How many millions of small events over 4,000 years must it have taken to get to that specific point in history? How many millions of little nudges is here? This person born, spoke to this person, and they believe this thing. And, what would it have taken? What did it take to, over time, nudge the world and get the world to move in that direction so that Jesus could be there? And still, I believe that there's still this element of free will. Like, God did not force this on us. God did not force Judas Iscariot, for example, to betray Jesus, but the event surrounding it was there. It's like, how does that work? Well, clearly not quickly. In Romans 5, verses 6 to 8, we read the following. You see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. At the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. What about Galatians 4, verses 4 to 7? But when the fullness of time had come, the fullness of time, like, this was like everything that was planned, the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are a son, God has sent the Spirit of sons into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you're no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. I don't think we truly understand how revolutionary this idea is. That every single one of us is made in the image of God. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't matter what color, what creed, where you come from. Because you are human and because you are made in the image of God, you are special, you are unique. So this idea of slavery, that you can own somebody else as a slave, which is very repugnant now in the world, but 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, this was not an issue, right? Like, people had slaves. But the very scriptures that tell us that we are in God's image gives us the mechanism to free ourselves from this kind of thinking. This is why there was the American Revolution, where people fought against slavery and people died to free slaves. Or if we look at, like, apartheid, for example, in South Africa, where there was an objective standard that we could turn to and say, but hey guys, you also believe the Bible. How can you say to me that I'm of an inferior, type of individual when God says to me that I am made in the image of God? We don't really understand how mind-blowing the concepts are that is in the Bible, and specifically what Jesus espouses, and that how that travels through time. It's mind-blowing. We've got no idea of what the full impact is of that. So why is Advent so important for us? You see, Advent season shows us that God works in His time and for His purpose. That things of lasting value take time. That's very important. You can't have a McDonald's experience with certain things in life, like relationships, and clearly you can't have it with the salvation of mankind. It is important for us to look at this time of hope and goodwill towards man and realize that God is in control of absolutely everything. Things might not happen in the time frames that we want, but that does not mean that God is absent and that things are not happening. You see, God is always faithful.